So this panel is about feedback. Feedback, the breakfast of champions. It's why we're all here. We all obviously believe in the power of employee feedback, and it's really about the benefits and the challenges that collecting feedback on a regular basis can have at your organization. So we have 4 fantastic TINYpulsers up here that are willing to share their insights and experiences with us. So first up, I'd like to introduce Brian Arnds. He's a CHRO of US Healthworks and is actively engaged in driving culture changes for the company's 4,000 associates in over 230 locations. With more than 20 years of experience in human resources, Brian has helped engagement in the healthcare, manufacturing, and hospitality industries. TINYpulsing with all of US Healthworks employees since the beginning of this year. Please welcome Brian Arnds. Okay, Megan Torres is the Senior Director of Organizational Communication at Providence Health and Services, the 3rd largest not-for-profit health system in the United States. Prior to joining Providence, Megan was Senior VP at global PR firm Weber Shandwick, where she also TINYpulsed. A TINYpulser since 2014. Please welcome Megan Torres. Okay, Toni Best is the Chief Human Performance Officer and co-founder at ADURO, a human performance company that promotes well-being in corporate workplaces. TINYpulsing since 2013. Welcome, Toni Best. Okay, and Faris Key is founder and CEO of Pixvana, a Seattle startup building a cloud video processing and delivery platform for mixed reality applications in virtual and augmented reality. He was previously founder and CEO of Seattle Boutique, which was acquired by Priceline, and where he also TINYpulsed. A TINYpulser since our beta in 2012. Please welcome Faris Key. All right. Thank you all for joining. It's great to have you here to share your experiences. Brian, you're newest to TINYpulse, so you probably have the best memory of what happened before TINYpulse. I'd love to hear about your experiences before, how you collected feedback before TINYpulse, and what led you to make that decision for your very large organization.
Well, we did it the old-fashioned way. It was pretty much pen and paper before SurveyMonkey came along. And we would collect from, at the time it was about 2,500 employees, we would do an annual survey. It would take respondents between 45 minutes to an hour. It was about 100 questions, and it was amalgamating all that information and then trying to digest it, and it was done on an annual basis. So from my perspective at the time, so by the time we got all the information collaborated and amalgamated, it was almost stale. So we didn't have that real time that we do now with TINYpulse.
We call that the giant pulse here at TINYpulse,
Yes.
100
Yes.
questions. I'd love to poll the audience. Who still does an annual, I know we talked about the certification yesterday, who still does an annual survey as well as TINYpulse? So a handful of you still do, great. And Megan, was that similar to you when you brought it to your 2 different organizations? Were you doing something different beforehand?
Yes, I'm talking specifically to Providence, where I am now. We still do the annual, so it was annual and it was anecdotal, and we would look through the verbatims that we would get, and we would call it manna from heaven. And we would scour, communications and executive comm as well as internal, and we would scour these verbatims for these nuggets, which is basically what we get weekly with TINYpulse. And they hold so much more weight when you're just looking at them at one point in time. So you miss that real feedback and that real-time change that you can do with TINYpulse.
Right. And Faris, you've been doing this since the beta, since before really pulsing was a thing. Did you do it because you felt like you were missing something, or you had met David and thought, this is a really cool idea, I want to give this a go?
I had met David. I had been at Microsoft right before my startup boutique, so I had been doing the annual pulse, the mega pulse, and as a user of that data as a manager, but also as someone who was giving feedback, I found it to be relatively ineffective. So when we started boutique, I had 2 co-founders who were also Microsoft employees, so a lot of our frame of reference of best practice HR, having both, 3 of us having been there 5, 6, 7 years each, we didn't really know any other HR process besides Microsoft. And there's a lot of wonderful components, but they didn't scale very well to a smaller organization when there was 10 of us. So I didn't think there were tools for small organizations, and was thrilled when I found out about TINYpulse and started using it.
Oh, good. And Toni, you've been doing this since 2013, and when ADURO was 20 employees, you've had incredible growth to over 100. I'd love to hear about the difference between what it was like at 20, and Forrest, you've had the same experience with a fast-growing company, and what it's like now with over 100 employees, and how it's changed over the years.
Sure. At 20 employees, we actually brought TINYpulse in because before that, I mean, we still have pretty close relationships with most of our employees, but 20 employees was about the time where it went from people just feeling okay, giving really direct feedback because we work so closely together, to it started feeling like something was off in the company and that people weren't talking about things at the same level they used to. We would have all company happy hours. All of a sudden they were having happy hours and weren't inviting us. So it was like the time when people started feeling like there was a separation between the company leadership and the rest of the company, even though most of them had been there for a long time. It was just a change in energy. So we felt like we needed to do something to give our team members a voice that felt like they could still tell us anything. And that was actually pretty challenging in the beginning because we were used to getting the feedback directly, and now we're getting it anonymously, and it wasn't always nice. So learning how to kind of take that and understand it. Now, the things that are really powerful are we don't have that same level of close relationship with every single person. We've grown really, really fast, and at the speed of change, the opportunity for people to give real-time feedback of the things that are happening right then and there has been even more powerful than it was then. Then it was kind of like, this is what I don't like about what's changing. Now it's like, these are the things that would really help us be successful. Can you please get started on these things? So just receiving all of that feedback and always keeping that pulse on the organization has been really powerful in all circumstances.
Right. And Forrest, how about you from going from about 20 to about 200 employees, and then how that compares to your experience now with your new company starting?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, there's that period of the first-time experience for the users where there's a little bit of distrust of the tool, all those early questions about is it really anonymous and what's in it for me? If I provide feedback, how is this going to benefit me? So I think at Boutique, over a course of 3 or 4 years of using the tool, growing from 20 people to 180 in 3 different offices globally, one in South America, where we had Latin American employees with really different cultural kind of frame of reference, and then European employees. The tool was a way that we kind of came together as a company, as a culture, and we shared the data in a very transparent way. We actually, as you added the feature, that one of my feature requests, we had permissions set so that every employee could see all the feedback, so it was 100% transparent. And that really made it kind of our virtual water cooler as a company culture. Now, Pixvana is only a 6-month-old company. There's 14 of us, and we've been using TINYpulse since there was 5 of us when we started. And I think the team is still getting reacquainted the way I saw my old team get acquainted with the tool, so I'm still building trust. I'm in that first phase of adoption. I just had a breakthrough moment recently. One of the first questions that's asked in the series for new users is a question about a company culture that says something to the effect of, with eyes closed, ears covered, hands tied behind your back, can you recite from memory your company's mission, vision, and cultural values? And that I remember that question with nostalgia from Boutique, because at the time that I saw that question in TINYpulse, as a founder, I looked at it, I thought, God, I don't even know our company mission and values, even though I had written them and I had posted them on the refrigerator in PowerPoint. And that kind of inspired me to go off and hire a design firm to actually turn our mission statement and our values into a poster that had a little kind of cute infographic. And we posted that poster up, and it had, as a visual story, it allowed everyone, including myself, to remember what our mission statement was and our values were. So now, using the tool again with the new startup, that's one of the first questions that we were asked. And this time I was out in front of it. I had already made the poster, the infographic. But it was great because we've already started to rally around that idea of what is our mission, what are our values, for a team that's really coming together for the very first time. There was, like I said, 5 of us in January, now we're up to 14. So with that small of a team just getting together, I think it's a fundamental tool for us to use the TINYpulse and the sharing of the data from TINYpulse to kind of define our culture. Because it's not just what I put into the poster, it's what we as a team decide our culture is going to be.
Yeah, I brought that up yesterday at certification about how we have an admin. I think you may be one of the only few, I think there's probably a few out there, that makes every employee an admin, so they can see it real time coming through, which is kind of a bold way of administering TINYpulse in kind of how TINYpulse was. And I'm wondering how you act with transparency and the feedback elsewhere on the panel. Do you share back verbatim? Do you share back in how do you do it?
We share the entire feed. We don't share as admins for every employee. And the only ones that we take out, I think I've taken out 3 ever in 3 years, and it was when a specific person was referenced by name, and I felt like it would be harmful to share that with the company. But we take every single feed and we actually share it out in our weekly communication so that people can see all of the comments that were made, all of the cheers, all of the suggestions, unless someone's marked it private, of course. And we get really good feedback from that, just people feeling like, we're sharing what everybody is saying with the whole company.
Yeah. How about you, Megan?
We do the same. We do a full report out. Our leader, who is a big champion for this, which of course always helps when you have a leader really focused on this sort of ongoing feedback, he shares in all kinds of venues, in our all hands meetings, which is everybody, in our leadership meeting, in our enterprise, which is the next level down, and in our one-on-ones. And it was actually something for us from a culture standpoint that was surprisingly hard for our leadership to embrace. Is just this trust and kind of opening of the kimono that is somewhat of a leap forward. And it was deciding around that approach was a really seminal moment for us, because healthcare, like a lot of industries, is going through a lot of change, and we were a team that had seen many reorgs over a small amount of time. And we were trying to instill this and celebrate this culture of not only safety, of course, because we're healthcare, but also resiliency. And we could use this point about transparency and approach to define how we wanted to be as a leadership team. And it was a really meaty but impactful moment for us.
Yeah, you mentioned the kind of the fear of some of the managers to see the feedback. Brian, you have tons of managers, a big organization. Did you have any resistance when you were introduced? I know you started with a kind of a smaller group, and then we're growing to your whole entire organization. I'd love to hear if you kind of met with resistance along the way.
Not so much resistance. I think people were uncertain or maybe weren't believing in the concept of it originally. We started with 1,000 people, and we had about 15 administrators. When I rolled it out to all, 4,000 people, we added another 100 administrators. So right now we have about 110 administrators, and all 110 administrators are actually on our leadership team. So the one way that I got them to really buy into it from the pilot phase was I made their annual incentive plan 20% predicated on TINYpulse usage. And it was a simple metric. It was, here's our baseline for our happiness trend. Let's just end the year better than we started it. So to me, that was kind of a signal that says, hey, you're the leader in the market, you're the leader in the in your vertical. Go out and make sure your employees are responding to you, make sure you're communicating with them, make sure that the open door policy is working, and by the way, here's feedback on a weekly basis where you can actually change the conversation. So I'm trying to hold the leadership, the management accountable to having kind of a weekly conversation with their people, huddles, if you will, and in our centers we'll have between 15 and 25, a little bit more in some cases, where a manager would have direct oversight of those people. And the idea is get the interaction going and use the feedback that we're getting from TINYpulse to drive that conversation.
Yeah. So this is called the feedback, the breakfast of champions, but when you started, it's kind of like breakfast, lunch, and dinner all in one setting. You get so much feedback in. I'm wondering how you dealt with that many employees all coming in at once.
So it was a little overwhelming, I will admit. One thing we did is we added more administrators. I mean, there just has to be more people in the tool if you want to get the private messaging and driving the feedback. I think for us, it was, I guess where we're coming from is we're trying to change a culture. So what I've learned yesterday and just the first couple of hours of being here is a lot of people are trying to measure their leadership. I think that's a second or third iteration for us. Right now, I'm trying to change an entire culture. And when you have 4,000 people in 20 different states, we've grown through acquisitions, so there's micro cultures that we're trying to meld together. And even more importantly, I think we're trying to put a larger company culture over the top of these microcultures. So for me, it was getting the leadership and management buy-in, tying it to their incentives so that they knew we meant it, put our money where our mouth is, if you will. But then taking the feedback, and what I do personally is not on every single question, but the qualitative questions, I'll kind of find out what the themes are, and I'll respond to all 100% of our employees about how the feedback came in for that week, or sometimes I'll combine 2 weeks together just to save time. The quantitative questions are easier to respond or push out because I'll literally just push everything out. So I use the reports that you guys provide and definitely share the graphs and the segmentations so that it's pretty transparent. I want people to see that this is actually coming in, and I try to get the feedback out, usually within a week, no more than 2. The summaries take a little bit longer because you have to be a little bit more thoughtful about what we're trying to communicate and pulling out all those themes. We're averaging right now about 1,000 to 1,200 responses per week. So getting all the administrators to kind of identify what those themes are, what are the top 2 or 3 that we want to focus on, and then I'll push that out in a summary format.
Yeah, and that's a lot of responses to go through every week. I'm glad you have a team to help out there. Megan, when we spoke earlier this week, we talked about how you just had your 1-year anniversary with TINYpulse at Providence, and how the beginning of the instance, there's a lot of quick wins. So you had them at Weber Shandwick, and you have them now. And now, a year in, how does it change, and what do you do with kind of like the secondary and tertiary feedback?
I mean, I think we just continue to get more sophisticated. We did just like you did, Brian. We expanded the scope and expanded the sphere that interacts with the tool. So it's really important for us. We're a huge organization. So we're 106,000 employees across 7 states, and we all work every day, probably like many of you, with virtual teams. And so we wanted to be sure that we had some sort of group that was in charge of implementing this change we wanted to see in our culture. So we created the action committee, and we had people across all levels, across all geographies. And they took that first massive influx of information and they mined it to come up with 4 themes that we wanted to focus on. And so that action committee is broken down into 4 different groups that work on the quick wins, which are easier to achieve. But then the harder stuff is what we're getting into now. And I just think we get more sophisticated the more we listen. And one thing that we really focus on as a group, which I love, is that the positives whisper and the negatives shout. So it's this constant with feedback. Anyone who has kids, it's like playing the hot and cold game. Like you're warmer, warmer, hot, hot, hot. You constantly need to be giving these positive high fives for every kind of one corrective that you give. There needs to be that right balance. So I think we're just getting smarter at giving the high fives, either virtual or in person.
Yeah, and that action committee you're talking about,
Yep.
we do it at TINYpulse. We have a culture committee, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you formed it, and if it's rotational or if it's a lifelong appointment like the Supreme Court. Or...
People just, it's kind of fun. No one's dropped out of it. Because you are a member of one of these 4 subcommittees, there's always somebody to help pick up the slack if you're having an incredibly busy stretch. And it goes back to leadership, and this was the same at Weber Shandwick. There's a phenomenal leader at Weber Shandwick who was behind it. It's just like our leader at Providence. He gives everybody the space to do this. It's not an insignificant amount of time. So outside of the 2 meetings that we have a month, one for just us and then one where we're presenting to our leader what we're hoping to put forward, we have probably each person spends 15, 20 hours outside of these meetings working on the initiative. And so it's really important to have that space for leadership to let us do that and to celebrate. So he brings up, we have the wind circulating all the time. We have a huge wind wall. We have all these, he sees, we had one piece of great feedback that they wanted him to do like a rose ceremony, a la The Bachelor at a retreat, and we did that. So they see it all the time, and he celebrates that action committee, which is, I think, why people don't drop off. He gave everybody at our anniversary, each one on the action committee, 2 days of PTO, which is priceless this day and age. So I think that's why people haven't left. We just keep getting new members.
Right. Oh, cool. Cool. And you mentioned people scream the negative. And Toni, you were at our first roundtable in Seattle a couple of years back, and someone brought up the term, we talked about this yesterday at the certification, the tiny punch. When, yeah, Fires knows too. When someone just goes in and drops some negative, and you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? I'd love to hear about any experiences or how you deal with that.
Oh, wow. This is my favorite question ever. The tiny punch is for sure it's the toughest part for me. I think that's probably true for all of us, getting that little tiny punch that's the negative bomb without the recommended what that individual thinks we could do better. It's really just the negative punch. And so typically, I snuggle up with my glass of wine to read, to read all the responses, because those tiny punches still actually hit me the same way as they did 3 years ago. I personally am a person where good enough is never good enough. So if there's an unhappy person, I need to figure out how to help that person, and that's really hard anonymously. So we have a few admins. We're always reaching out to those people and saying, thank you for letting us know that this is bothering you. Can you please give us more information? What do you think we could be doing better? We're always asking them to actually bring a solution to the table. We are not the, just because we're leaders or on the people team, we don't have all the answers. And clearly you have some insight, so bring it to us. We don't always get responses back from that, but we know we're giving that person another opportunity to just kind of share what they, how they might be able to help, or how they think we can do a better job. And I think that, just in kind of gathering what those tiny punches are, we can either identify whether this is just an angry person that has a need to lash out and kind of wants somebody else to feel hurt too, and we're not going to be able to do anything with that one anonymous comment. Or do we see a trend of these little tiny punches that are coming along and trying to break that down into what can we do with that group of tiny punches that seem to keep coming. So that's always still an evolution of how do we handle those ones that we're not going to get anything back in a private comment, but we're still going to give them the opportunity to share it with us, and that's part of the thing with TINYpulse. It's anonymous. It's an opportunity for them to vent sometimes, but we do always ask them to try to bring a solution to whatever
the TINYpulse rules.
Yeah.
Right. I noticed that as well with our TINYpulse. Sometimes you'll just get these people just dropping negative stuff, and you think, you should be happy at work, and you're clearly not happy. So, Forrest, if you hadn't had this at Boutique or now at Pixvana, where you just kind of have this repeating negative feedback, and you think, well, how am I going to deal with this? And do you do private messaging to try to solve that?
Well, we definitely, as relatively early users of the tool, I think you mentioned that term to me, and when you said it, it was kind of like validation, because the 10 tiny punches that had been given, I immediately recognized, oh, that's the phenomena. And Toni, you're a better person than me, because I aptly named best. But it was hard. You sometimes the message, you really want to focus on the message and what proactively might be extracted from that with private feedback. But at Boutique, I think we instead took it public, and we said, look, if there's something proactive that you want to contribute to making things better here, then we absolutely want to talk about it and engage, and there's ways to do that, and let's think of creatively how you might surface those issues in a way that's proactive and constructive. But if you just want to dump on everyone, then maybe you should investigate where you might be happiest. And that's not an invitation to quit. It's just an invitation for that individual to think about how they're contributing to the culture proactively versus just blaming and looking for others to take responsibility for their own issues. We had dozens of more constructive feedbacks that came in, sometimes about people not being happy or feeling undervalued or considering looking around. And we took that as a more proactive invitation for a dialogue. We would start with private messaging. You try not to think about who, because once you start trying to figure out who's ferreting out the engineer that's not happy on the engineering team because it came from that part of the pulse, you can kind of get off track and start to to not take the feedback which was being given. I'll say several times successfully I was able to identify someone that was unhappy through the tool, which is not the purpose of the tool, but to great effect in the sense that it wasn't maybe what they intended, but it led to me as a manager being able to solve problems in the department, or to implement new programs, or to create one-on-one opportunities for people to then sometimes reveal, like, yeah, that was me in TINYpulse. And I didn't have to ask them, they just kind of volunteered it because they were looking for a way to engage. And sometimes it starts with an anonymous feedback loop and turns into a one-to-one. So I'd say that the punches, I think it's better to like engage immediately and say, look, this is not what the purpose of the tool is. And certainly with 1,000 employees answering a week, that's going to get lost in the noise, having negative feedback loops. So they're not actually going to get anything out of that. They're going to dump on the tool and then walk away from it. So I think it's much more interesting if you can coach everyone to use the tool proactively, to engage, sometimes through private messaging, and look for solutions instead of blame.
Right.
I will say, though, that the tiny punches do come through. Fast and furious. In fact, sometimes I'll sort the responses by all the 1s, 2s, or 3s just so I can focus on those ones, and also the 8, 9s, and 10s, of course. But I will have to say I had a tiny punch story that actually was a success story. They were frustrated because we kept sending them TINYpulse questions once a week. By design, right? And they finally just unloaded on a private message and said, could you please take me off the system? I don't want to be on TINYpulse. And why do you keep asking the same questions over and over? It's like they just totally didn't get the concept of what it was. So I responded to him through a private message and said, number one, I can't just take you off the system because I don't know who you are. But if you'd like to reveal yourself, I'd be happy to remove you. Secondly, TINYpulse has done a lot in the short time we've had it, and I listed a whole series of wins that have impacted, most of our frontline employees. And I said, I'm sorry you feel this way, but respect it, and if you'd like me to remove you from the system, I'm happy to do so, just let me know. Of course, I never heard back from this person until 2 weeks ago. They rated a 10 and said I was the one that wanted to be removed. I love TINYpulse because we've actually done things that have made the work environment for at least this person a little bit better. So they figured out how to use the system and how to leverage it to their benefit. And I think that's kind of the point, is we want to hear from our employees whether it's good, the bad, or the ugly. In fact, like I said, I sort usually when I'm going through it, I sort out the 1s, 2s, and 3s first, because that's where the biggest challenges are. That's where you can make the most impact the quickest. Your 8s, 9s, and 10s are generally happy folks who are doing a good job, and they're kind of spreading the love, if you will. So it's not that you ignore one or the other, but I probably spend more time on the disgruntled folks, because that's where I think the opportunity is.
That's probably true of all managers. I think as managers, you're always looking to help and to improve, and that negative feedback, ironically, is kind of the most valued feedback, because that's where the change comes from.
You mentioned the TINYpulse convert, and I'm really happy that he's now a 10, or he or she's now a 10. And I find that employees become more bought in when they realize, okay, this is worth my while. Even though I know it's anonymous, I'm putting myself out there by giving this feedback. There is this power dynamic between employers and employees. And so I think showing them that there is change being made, and that's why we have the Wall of Wins now. But Megan, you have a great story from back when you were at Weber Shannon, like how before the Wall of Wins, a digital collection of wins, how you celebrated wins, and you have the sticker that you made. I talked about it yesterday, but I'd love for you to tell the audience.
And I can't take credit for this. This was the leader of our office, this woman, but it was really cool. I think it was within maybe the first few weeks, there was this suggestion that it's a global PR firm, and there's lots of women in PR, at least, that's a trend in our Seattle office. And so there was this lovely individual who gave this feedback that why do we not have a place in the ladies' bathroom to put our bag or papers? We're all running from meetings to meetings, and we have to bring all our stuff with us to the stall, or we need to put it on the wet counter. And so Michelle Meggs, who runs the office in Seattle, she quickly got a table that women could rest their things on, and then she put a very physical reminder that was brought to you by TINYpulse. And so people knew right away that their feedback could get responded to. And then it started some sort of internal competition. The men then wanted their bathroom to be a lounge, and they used this tool to make sure that there was equity in the bathrooms.
I love
But that's
it.
what you mean, right? Is that what you're
Yeah,
referencing?
yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
yes.
Yeah. How about, Toni, how about at ADURO, how do you make sure the employees know that, okay, you've given this feedback and here are the things that we're doing because of your feedback?
We do that in many ways. One is the Wall of Wins, which we've just started to use, but our employees aren't really looking at that so much at this point. And so we have two ways that we're constantly communicating to our employees. We have a standing Friday all-company meeting at 9:30 a.m. I don't think we've ever missed one in all the years of business. And so we're always updating on what we're doing in the company and why, and what feedback we've gotten from TINYpulse and how we've acted on it. And we also share it in our weekly wildfire all-employee newsletter, where we talk about the changes that we've made and where they came from. We oftentimes will tag a certain TINYpulse comment. One of our most recent additions was an ice machine, which who knew that was what was so important, but we saw it from like 3 different people for 4 TINYpulses in a row, and we're like, all right, well that seems like an easy fix to make some people happy.
Is it TINYpulse branded ice cubes? I don't know where that was from.
That would be really good. But just little things like that where we're highlighting how their feedback is making a difference in our company communications.
Yeah. Cool. And Forrest, how about you with Boutique as you grew from 20 to 200? How did you make sure that employees who came later on, who weren't really in that kind of original group of TINYpulsers, know that, hey, this is worthwhile, this is worth your time?
Well, like Toni, we did 9 a.m. stand-ups on Monday, and then we did a 4 o'clock wrap all hands on Fridays. And we often had TINYpulse kind of feedback loop that we would reflect and put up data or talk about changes that were being made. So it was very much front and center. Everybody knew that it was part of how the decisions were made about culture. As I'm listening to some of the scale adoption, 1,000-person organization, I can't imagine that there's very different challenges than what we face. But as we got into 150, 200 people, as I said, in 3 offices internationally, there was dozens of things meaningful things that we changed, starting with the kitchen, the bathroom, the food. Music was a big thing because we had no music policy, and TINYpulse helped us devise a music policy that was agreeable to everyone because we had music on in most of the floor. So those were the little things and relatively quick things. Some of the bigger things, I'd say, were dealing with diversity, dealing with growing pains as related to the compensation and achievement of different departments, like the customer success team. We had a period where we had higher churn or reclass or some of the things that software companies deal with. And I'd say that it was a barometer throughout the life of the company where people came together to talk about culture, to make suggestions, and then we would always reflect those back. I think a common theme, and for those of you using the tool, I think a common thing is, I don't know if it's a factor, if it's just my perception, BJ, but people that stop using TINYpulse, that leave the company and the product, are probably the ones that are not using the tool to reflect in a mirror back to the team the feedback loop. And that is what leads to disenchantment, because if you're providing the feedback, imagine if you're putting in a 1 or a 5 and there's no private message from somebody in management that turns that person into a 10, then it can be disheartening, right? So that user was disenchanted already. You were able to turn that user around. If you have dozens or hundreds of employees that are putting information into the system but don't feel it reflected back in any way, I think that's a big problem for the users and for the use of the tool. So best practice, I think, is always to use that information, somehow present it back, whether it be putting plaques in the bathroom or at the stand-ups like we do, or I also send out an email every 2 to 3 weeks summarizing what I've heard in the tool. And people light up when they hear that their feedback is being listened to and acted on. Just last Friday, I did a summary that I haven't done in about 3 weeks, so there's a lot of data. So I was copying and pasting some of the quotes in that I liked. I was highlighting things. And one of the lowest scores was a 7. We're a small team, so 7 is a bad score for us. And it was a complaint about lack of diversity in the company. And we right now, as a founding team, it's kind of old and male. So we've been trying aggressively to improve diversity with women and younger people. And there was a question, the comment was 7 not happy with the culture because there aren't enough women and young people. So it gave me an opportunity to not only answer to that person, but to actually talk about how important diversity is. And it was actually one of the things that I was looking for an avenue to introduce that into the conversation for our recruiting. So the TINYpulse, served my interest, but it also very directly addressed one of the employees. And she came up to me, it was a young woman on the team, the next day and said, "That was fantastic. I'm so excited to hear that you care about these things, et cetera, et cetera." So that feedback, if I hadn't provided that feedback, if she had just said that statement and weeks had gone by, months had gone by, I think she would have felt very differently about her effort to contribute to the tool.
Yeah. Cool. You mentioned earlier when you segmented out and you had the customer success, you noticed there was some dip in happiness. I'm wondering when you grew, and Forrest and Toni, when you grew from these small companies to large enough to have segments, how did that change your perception of the feedback and your employees' perception of the feedback, and if they knew that they were then in this kind of smaller group?
As far as anonymity.
As far as anonymity. Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest change that it's had for us is that, as a small team, we've always talked about how the culture in the company is really built by all of the people. It's not just leaders and the decisions that we make, but they're still looking to us to drive the culture. And as our team has grown, and it's a lot harder for us to, really have that deep understanding of what's happening in all parts of the company and enrolling all of the leaders into kind of owning what's happening in their part from a culture perspective, not just from a performance perspective or, from listening to the conversation in the room perspective, but really that feedback that's being given and bringing solutions both to the leadership team and having really candid conversations with their teams about, hey, we know there's a couple of you that are really unhappy about these things. And, we're looking for you to actually, you're the ones that are recognizing that that's an issue. Can you help us, better document those procedures for you or whatever they are that's coming from that department? So segmenting has really helped us see what's going great and what the struggles are in different parts of the company and enroll those leaders into being stewards of the culture rather than just relying on the people team to be the stewards of the culture, and then actually enrolling their people to be a part of making sure that we're keeping the culture great because we're all being part of the solution. So I think that's been the biggest difference is that we have more champions on a daily basis of making sure that we keep a great culture.
Changing lanes a little bit, we don't have much time, so I wanted to ask Brian, in terms of custom questions, so at smaller organizations you can just say, hey, this came up, I want to ask this question, but at such a large organization, do you have kind of a longer term question strategy, or do you kind of take it as it comes in, you think, oh, I want to ask a specific question, or do you just use the TINYpulse questions as they come through?
We're using the curated questions for the most part, but about once a month we'll ask a specific question that is relevant to our workforce so that they know that there is some customization to the tool. And that's actually been very effective for us and has actually caused a lot of wins for us because the feedback that comes back through those custom questions are so specific. So I'm using both.
Yep. How about you, Megan? Do you often do custom or?
For us, that was we mentioned earlier how there was some, on our leadership team, there was some hesitancy to really lean into this tool. And that was actually the way that we got everybody to embrace it, even at our senior-most levels, is using the custom question more. So we showed that we could help ease their way with what they were facing if they contributed a custom question. And it was the surest way to get buy-in. They automatically saw the impact, and it helped them with what they were struggling with or what they had been tasked to do.
Oh, cool. Toni, a favorite custom question, or what do you do with that?
Well, we use the curated questions about 90% of the time, but I would say my favorite use of the custom question, it was actually just over a year ago. 2015 was a really tough year for us in terms of how fast our company grew. There was some turmoil inside of the culture. TINYpulse was an enormous part of really getting the feedback and understanding how we could do better during big time of growth, and we did a lot of custom questions at that time around our core values and our mission, and you know, it was a changing time in the company. We felt like we had values, but they were very me-centric. How do I show up better, and not very like looking bigger than ourselves. And so we asked a lot of custom questions during that time that were really around what do you see as the things that are really important to you in the culture. And based on the feedback that we got from those custom questions, it shaped really what our vision, what our core values are, and especially the thing that we saw no matter what question we asked was this focus on possibility, and that ADURO is all about unlocking possibility, about being open to possibility, about serving this idea that anything is possible. And so, you know, it created a mantra in the company of open to possibility. And so, you know, we tend to focus on the custom questions when there's something that is like really burning in the company, and that's probably my favorite example of it. Is that's where our current mantra and our core values came from, and people are really into them because they helped to build and create them. So
Cool. How about you, Forrest?
I definitely use the custom questions periodically, but in some ways when I ask a custom question, they're less valuable answers because maybe it's limited to my own ability to come up with the question. Whereas some of the curated questions I would never have asked, and I've grown to love them. Again, I'm on my second cycle, so I was looking forward to the fortune cookie question, which probably most of you have seen, because I'd seen that at Boutique, and I was like, wow, what a neat question, and the responses were really interesting, and people, you know, very creative. Oh, we're orca whales, because the orca is a native animal here in the Puget Sound, and that led to a whole bunch of use of the orca whale as a mascot within the teams. In fact, the sales team organized into pods like the orca whale, so we had L pod and J pod. And that, I would have never asked that question, right? That whole happy accident of a curated question. Another one I love is some of the subtleties, like there's a question that comes, I think, in like week 15 or 16. We haven't seen it yet at Pixvana. Something to the effect of you've left the company, and now tell, you know, like in the future you've left, and describe why you left. And it's a subtle twist on the question of why would you leave. It's asking it after the fact, as if you've already left. And it was neat to see at Boutique, where we had 180 people, where like 70% of the people in the answer said, I don't know why I would have left. You know, and that was actually more insightful than asking someone to imagine leaving kind of before they left. So I don't know who writes the questions, but I love a lot of the curated questions. And I imagine that over time they're crowdsourced a bit. I'm sure as Brian puts in some of his questions from a larger HR perspective, those will benefit me as a smaller team, because those will trickle down into the tool. I'm sure you guys look at across your user base.
Right. So favorite piece of feedback or insight received via employee feedback, Brian?
Oh my gosh, there's so much of it. I think the favorite feedback for me is when I respond to a private message, or a CEO responds to a private message, and they say, wow, I can't believe you took the time to respond. That just tells me that people do want to be heard, and they do feel that they're kind of lost in the crowd. So there are a lot of instances where there's specific stuff that's going on, and you know, we've been able to save people from resignation. We've been able to correct situations for individuals that have kept them with the company, and certainly those are huge wins for us. But I think in terms of the communication and the feedback, I just like to know that I like, you know, the 4,000 people who are on the system to know that they are being heard. And I generally include that in my summary feedback as well. And you know, if we can't get to every single virtual suggestion or every single private message, we do get to about 70 or 80% of them on average. So keep pulsing, keep bringing the feedback, because you will get heard, and you will get your feedback listened to or responded to. Some of the things that I think from a larger perspective, you know, when we aggregate kind of the information, this is actually kind of funny. So 2 things happened. We heard loud and clear that people were very displeased with our 401k match. And that's something we had on our calendar to evaluate in 2018, but because it became so clear through TINYpulse that this was a large company issue, we actually took it to the board of directors last quarter and moved that up, and basically we're going to triple the 401k match at our company. So we announced that, and it was kind of like, like, okay, well, that's good. Then a couple weeks later, you know, this is like thousands of dollars to like each person, right? Then a couple weeks later, we send out, you know, through feedback, again, we send out a memo saying, we've heard you on TINYpulse, and 2016 will be the first year that the company is going to sponsor holiday events. You would have thought our IT systems blew up because people were like, and I'm talking like a $25 per person event. The feedback was not only through TINYpulse, but through our email chains, to our CEO, to my mailbox. It's like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. So it was kind of like, wow, here we're investing in your long-term retirement strategy or a holiday party. Both are really good things, by the way, and both are certainly helping us change culture, but it's just so funny how different things affect the population and the culture. And all of these things it would not have been on the calendar for 2017 had it not been for TINYpulse. So I think that's another example of that we can address with our population at large is like, listen, we're reprioritizing decisions, we're thinking how we're budgeting stuff, we're evaluating basically everything and anything based on feedback. So bring the feedback.
Cool. Thank you for that. That was awesome. I wish I can get everyone's favorite insights. We have to break up for time for questions from the audience. We'd love to hear what you have in mind.
My question for you is, it's really easy as a manager to communicate the wall of wins and all of that. How do you communicate the things you are choosing not to address that come up through the surveys and things you are consciously saying? You hear a lot of feedback from the people, but we're not going to do this. How do you handle that?
I'll go. We have a strategy of addressing everything, even if we are not addressing it in that month. So for us, the real sticky one is around prioritization. And that's one of our subgroups in this action committee. And we hear it over and over again that people feel under-resourced and overwhelmed. So we know we need to solve for this prioritization piece, and it's the hardest thing to do because your quick wins happen early, and this is the one that stays with us, and it's the one that we've kind of taken a pause in the fall, and we have a fall focus of 3 things that we're doing. And one of the ones is getting this darn in-scope and out-of-scope document that everyone's asking for. And we will get it done, but we address everything, even if it's something that we don't directly impact, like benefits or our PTO policy or our work from home policy. Even if it's something we cannot directly control, we can clarify the policy, which is sometimes really critical, and then we just put it farther down on the to-do list. We address everything we hear.
The same for us. We address it whether or not we can impact it. And a lot of the things that come up are, you see themes. Under-resourced and overwhelmed I think that's probably a common theme in a lot of companies. It certainly is in ours, and especially certain segments of the company. And so it's a conversation that we're always having. We're recognizing that. We're talking about the ways that we are that we're attempting to make a difference in that way, and to keep them bringing the feedback about what things we are doing and how we're implementing those, so that they can continue to give us the feedback if that is making a difference. But we communicate those things actually in the same way we communicate the wins, right? In our Friday meetings, in our weekly newsletters. We're hearing this, we get it, we see that this is going on. Here's why we are or are not looking at it at this time. And I think that that's part of the transparency. It's one of the greatest gifts we've gotten from TINYpulse is this idea of transparency. We now have TVs on the wall that show all of our company numbers all the time. And so just that we recognize that at least communicating about it and talking about we're not doing anything about it at this time, it shuts down the water cooler conversation a little. So at least they know that they've been heard and that we're aware that something is happening, and we're communicating why we are or are not going to take that on at this
Just
time.
because the team is asking for something, TINYpulse doesn't mean it has to be done. I remember the sales team didn't like working till 6. Some people wanted flexible schedules. And we had said in the hiring that it was going to be a 9 to 6 culture in sales, and we had our reasons for doing that. And I'm having a little bit of a flashback thinking about this. We had to say, no, we're not going to do it, and we apologize. We thought we made that clear on the way in the door, but this is what we believe we need to do, and here's why. And I think just having heard the feedback, reiterating our position, explaining why we weren't going to make a change just because people were asking, that was still valuable. to be heard and to have a dialogue, even if it didn't result in the change that the employees were asking for.
And I think for us, what we did is we developed 4 culture goals that the company is well aware of. So if any of the things come in that would work towards one of those 4 culture goals, then it is going to go on the consideration list. And if it's something that's just off the wall or is a one-off to maybe one location or maybe even one person, we'll let them know that right now that doesn't fit into the master plan. But we do keep a list of the stuff that is being requested anyway, just so that we can go back to it at another time. But we do let them know, again, with full transparency. We can't solve all the problems all the time right now, but we prioritize them and we'll get to them when we can.
Hi, Talina from the Bahamas. I think Forrest may have touched bases on this. How do you handle employees who want something in return for a suggestion they may have brought to the team?
Like they want their suggestion accepted or implemented specifically?
They want rewards, recognition.
Well, so I'm in technology. I'm not sure, what industry are you in the Bahamas?
We regulate the city.
Okay. So probably a different industry than West Coast technology. So I'll say lovingly of my cohorts, there's a lot of entitlement as employees because there's a lot of competition for every single person on the engineering team is getting calls weekly to be recruited away for 2 to 3 times the salary to go work at Google, Amazon, Microsoft, to name 3, Facebook. So I can't win on benefits. I can win on culture. I can win on accountability of our culture. I can win on the experience of the job. Dan Price was talking about this earlier as well. I don't do the exercise that Dan does where I say, well, if everyone was here for free, what would they do? But we try to pay competitively against our comp set, which is other technology companies. And then within that, we try to be much better in the things that we can control. And I'd say that the dynamics that TINYpulse produces within our culture are winning formula against Google, where Google can't have this level of attention to feedback and discussion. I think it's admirable for larger companies to implement, and it would certainly, if I was at a larger company, keep me at the larger company. So I think you look for the wins and the value that it can bring to your organization, and just using the tool in some ways is a huge win for the employees.
We give a lot of recognition around that too. Just when you bring an idea up and it's a really great idea, if you tell us it was you and that was your idea, then we recognize you. We don't necessarily give you some kind of reward, but the recognition and talking about why it was important to the company, I think that's important because it helps to reinforce the idea that your feedback is good, that your ideas matter, and that we want to hear them. And so, recognizing that individual and showcasing them as a star in that way helps other people to continue to want to provide feedback and bring their great ideas forward.
And we do a very similar thing, but a twist. So not against suggestions or the feedback tool, but Cheers for Peers, we call employees caregivers. And so we have this MVP recognition that is around the Cheers for Peers. So we have this site that is This Caregiver Rocks. And that individual that we select as MVP is taken from the Cheers, and they get a small incentive. And that's the way that we try and recognize that tool, because it is that piece of it. I'm sure everyone has the same experience. The suggestions are amazing, but that virtual high five is such a wonderful tool.
Hi, my name is Madhuri, and I am here from the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. So we are about 1,000 employees today, and widely distributed around more than 100 chapters in the US. And these chapters can range anywhere from 2 to 3 staff members to 15. We don't pulse right now. We don't do TINYpulse. We don't do any kind of pulse. And so we need to, so let me put it this way. We are aware of a lot of issues in different pockets of the organization. And one of the fear of moving in this direction of greater transparency with these kind of platforms is the fear of revealing what we know is to be true today. And so I mean, in your experience, and I'm looking towards Brian and Megan just from the size of the organization, is what would you recommend as the steps that we could take to make both the leaders and the organization comfortable with the idea that despite what we know and what this is going to reveal, that it is the right thing to do moving forward, and it's going to empower us to do things that we are not able to do today because we don't have the data to back it up, right? Any thoughts there? Any wisdom?
So from my perspective, I knew that we needed a culture change. We're deliberately trying to get from one style of culture to another. And I also know that based on our manager tenure of more than 12 years on average, that some people were going to be hard to bring along. So I had that discussion with the leadership team and said, we're going to find out some things that we don't necessarily want to know, and it may be about us collectively or maybe about some individuals or some issues that, I think everybody kind of knows they're there, but they're not public and there's no information or data around it. So we went into it eyes wide open, knowing that that was going to be a risk. But I think the good thing is that once you start getting the information, it is anonymous, so you have to deal with it in that fashion. But once you start getting the information and the data, it really gives you, it almost creates a pathway of how to fix the issues. So for me, the information, it's not about who it's coming from or even where it's coming from, really. For me, it's just what is the information and how can we get enough of it to, take action on it. And I think if you go into it with the idea that we're not a perfect organization, but we want to become better, the feedback is going to come and it's going to support that. It may seem a little pie in the sky, but we've been TINYpulsing since January for about 1,000 people, and we went to 4,000 people in June. And I mean, the wins have been so fast, and despite some of the negative comments that we get, the culture is actually changing. I thought it would be a 3-year transition. I thought it'd be a 3-year culture change. We're hardly, 6 months into it full bore, and I've already seen tangible difference. So I think you should go for it.
You'll have the data if you go for it. Right now, your fear might be worse than the data. So
exactly.
Turn on some kind of survey and find out what the survey says.
And I think the realism is good to have. So I love TINYpulse, and I will take it everywhere I work. Mm-hmm. But it is not a panacea. So it doesn't create the culture. It doesn't create great leaders. You still have to you have to round with your people. You have to have your one-on-ones. You have to celebrate. All this stuff still needs to happen. It's just one more tool that you have, and it takes the emotion out of it because it's the data. It's real time. It's easy. It's just one way to help you get there, but it's not the silver bullet.
The other thing I would say, if I could, real quick, I know we're running out of time, but I sat with our leadership team, there's 11 of us, and I said, this is after the 1,000-person pilot. And just based on their interactions in the first couple of months, I said, I'm going to recommend that we don't go forward with TINYpulse. Because if you guys don't support it, it can't just be me supporting it. I need full buy-in from the entire team. Because you have to have that upper level support in order to carry it through effectively. So I was like, I'm recommending we don't go forward with launching it to 4,000 people. And my CEO was like, huh, what? We're committed to this. I'm like, well, show me. Show me you're committed to it. And actually, at the end of that meeting, they said, no, we've got to go forward with this. And having that support, I think, will help you take those results and turn them into action inside your organization.
I just have one quick thing to add, which is the truth is your people already know those problems exist. And so I think one of the greatest gifts is they're already talking about it. If you're giving them an avenue to share it with you, then now you and the company leaders know the things which may be much more they may be much more evident to the employees than they are to the leaders, because a lot of times the employees are afraid to tell the leaders of what's going on or how they feel about it. And so at least you'll then know what they already know and have an ability to do something about it and choose which things you want to do something about and what's going to make the greatest impact. So if you can get the leadership on board, the people already know what they're about to tell you. So I think there's a lot of power in that as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brian, Megan, Toni, and Faris. It was really fantastic hearing your insights. Thank you.